Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, we're going to create cards and do an easy water background technique. I have a ton of these die cuts and foiled images from a previous card, and I'll link to that at the end of this video. So we're going to use those up and create some cards. I have a couple pieces of distress watercolor cardstock here and a piece of acetate. Now my watercolor cardstock as well as my acetate is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and that's the easiest way to position the ink on this acetate to know where it's going to go on the front of my card is by having the same size. And I'm doing one background with distress inks, and I smushed those inks onto that acetate, misted it with some water, and then pressed that color onto my background. Now I'm going to add a little bit more layers to this simply because that top layer or the lightest color, I didn't get a whole lot of that color down there. So I am going to do multiple layers, but you could do this in a single layer if you want. And I am doing a water background because my die cuts and stuff like that are all fish and water animals or greenery, and I want a background to create those cards. But these can easily be changed to different colors, and it's just a way to create a different, very easy, very loose watercolor looking background. Now, anything dye-based would work for this. Like I said, I'm doing the first background with distress pads. The next background, I'm going to do some markers with it. So anything that's dye-based, you could absolutely do this. I could even do this with some distress reinkers or any dye-based ink pad reinkers. I could put that onto my acetate, leave it as it is, or use a brush to spread it around, mist it with water, and then press it onto the cardstock. The main thing though is you need to work with dye-based products, and the paper that you're wanting to put this on, you want to make sure that it can handle water. So I'm using watercolor paper. You could also use mixed media cardstock because that can handle the moisture. I'm using a heated tool here to dry the ink between layers. You don't necessarily need to. You could leave that ink wet and then add the next layer. They're going to blend together more rather than layer if you do it that way. If you want to get an even more layered look, you can make sure that it's even drier than what I'm doing. I'm just getting it to the point where the ink isn't flowing anymore, but you could completely dry it and then add more ink to it. Now, because this is dye-based, the inks are still going to rehydrate and blend to a point, but you'll get a little bit more of a layered look, just like doing a distress background if you're drying the ink between each and every layer. It also gives you a better idea of how the ink is going to look once it is completely dried and whether or not you need that extra layer on there. Now I think, if I remember correctly, this is my last layer for this one. And again, you can do as many or as few layers as you want, and you can also change up the colors. The distress pads, I just realized I didn't say which ones I was using. I used Speckled Egg, Salty Ocean, and Uncharted Mariner. And I tried to make sure that I had lighter towards the top, darker towards the bottom, but you can mix it up to whatever you want. So for the second one here, I'm pulling out my Karen markers. I haven't used them for a little bit, so I'm going to pull them out and use them. But you could use Tombow markers. Again, any dye-based product would work for this. You just want something that's going to be activated by water and get nice and flowy for that background. So I'm using Warm Gray 3, Arctic Blue, Cyan, and Royal Blue. And I'll have all of these listed in the description below. So if you wanted to know the exact colors, you can see them down there. So I did exactly the same as before, but I scribbled the markers on here, sprayed them with the distress sprayer, and then pressed it onto the cardstock and then lifted up my cardstock here. Now my cardstock is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I know that I'm going to be cutting it down. So when I pulled this up, I had planned to do extra layers on this one, just like I did on my first one. I really liked the look of that background and how subtle it was compared to the other one. So I left it with one layer. I didn't add any more layers to it, and you could see that my ink pooled towards the left hand side. An easy way to remove that is just to fold a piece of paper towel in half and just suck that up. Any area around that edge that's going to have a heavier concentration of ink, I'm going to be trimming this down anyways to fit onto the front of my card, so I know that I can trim off those areas. Once again, I'm using that heated tool to just dry that ink out, but you could easily leave it to air dry if you want. The heated tool is just going to speed up the process and make it so that you can go to the next step a little bit quicker. And once those pieces are completely dried, I cut them down a little bit smaller. So I cut them down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And I have a piece of white cardstock here. Well, I have two pieces that are 4 inches by 5 1/4. Rather than trying to match up a solid cardstock, all I did was use one of the markers that I used for my background and colored around the edge to create a mat for that piece. And then for the distressed ink background one, I did the same thing with a distressed pad on a piece of 4 inches by 5 1/4 inch cardstock. This way I know that my mats are going to match exactly perfectly, and I didn't have any cardstock that was going to match them. It's an easy trick in order to get things matching perfectly and saving yourself the time, and rather than cutting into a full sheet of cardstock. So for both of these cards, my layout is going to be fairly similar. I have a lot of these pieces and die cuts to use up, and rather than coming up with two completely different cards, I just kept the layout fairly similar. Now the pieces themselves are a little bit different for some of them. Like that jellyfish is the same. I just have one positive foil and one negative foil. The under the sea glimmer piece in the center of the cards, they're different from both, but you're not going to notice a huge difference. It's just how you layer them out. And then I have my die cuts, and I just like to put a clear acrylic block on my card base when it's drying, and it makes a really easy surface to try out different layouts and see what you like. You can easily move things around. You could see it against the background, see which pieces work best where. And then when my background or my base is dry underneath, I can easily lift that to the side, and I haven't lost my design. I don't have to remember where anything goes. I can then simply place everything exactly where I want it to on the front of the card and not worry about trying to remember how I had everything placed. It's the easiest way to figure out a layout and see it against the background. And by doing it this way, I can just keep moving everything around until I come up with a layout that I like, without having to worry about something glued down and then having to pry it up because I changed my mind. This is the easiest way to come up with a layout and know that you're not going to have to lift anything up or worry about things when you're gluing them down. By dry fitting or dry placing everything on top of the acrylic block, you know exactly what you're going to get when you go and start to glue things in place. So as soon as I come up with a layout that I like and that I'm happy with, I will start to put those onto my card bases. Now I am going to put those matted pieces onto my card base before I start gluing my little die cut pieces together or to the front, because I want some of those pieces to go off of that matted area just to give it a little bit more of an interesting look. So one of my cards is a top folding. This one on the right here is a top folding card that I happen to have. The other one is a side folding. This will work for either fold. It's just personal preference, which one you prefer better. Either one will work. So with that card or with that mat onto the base, I'm going to start gluing things together. And I'll keep in mind the areas where I want a die cut tucked behind there. And I'm not putting that centerpiece down. I just laid it there gently so that it wasn't going to start to glue down before I put those die cuts behind there. It's really easy to lift those off when you're using liquid glue and to put the acrylic block on there in between so that it holds things down. And it's especially important for that centerpiece where I have some die cuts behind it and a few die cuts in front of it. I want to make sure that there's a little bit of pressure on there to hold those down. With that liquid glue, sometimes it starts to cup some of the cardstock a little bit, and by holding it down for a few seconds, it just gives it a time for that glue to start grabbing, and that way I don't necessarily have to worry about that glue cupping the cardstock and then drying on me before it starts to grab that cardstock. With that first one done, I can start working on the second one. And you can see how it just makes it a little bit more interesting when some of those die cuts go a little bit off of that mat. It just gives it a little bit more interest. And you can also see how having two different backgrounds, neither one is right or wrong, but you just get a little bit of a different vibe from each one of them. And in general, the die placement for each one of those is the same. There's just a few different die cuts or a few different colored fish or whatnot, but the layout itself is pretty close to identical to each other, but you still get a slightly different look with each one, simply because of the different background, because the fish are colored a little bit different, or you have a positive or negative foil. It just gives a slightly different variation. This is just a great way to use up a bunch of die cuts that you already have done the work for. You already have them die cut ready to go. We might as well use them and create a few bonus cards. And it comes in so handy when you have all these little pieces that are already created, already made, and ready to go. It makes a couple very quick cards. So I've got my front of my cards completely done, but I thought it'd be nice if the inside of the cards match. So I did the matte around the white cardstock exactly the same as the front of my card, and then I chose some of the foiled sentiments that I had created for the card that I had created at the time that I created the rest of these die cuts and foiled pieces. I'll use that in the center because once again, we've got them already done. The foiling matches the foiled images on the front. We might as well use those up and use them in a card that it coordinates it really well with. So I put those acrylic blocks on there to hold everything in place while I was gluing the next step, and then I can glue them onto the inside of the card. Now, I left the inside of my cards fairly plain. I didn't do anything other than those sentiments, but with that acrylic block on there, you can test it out and try other die cuts and some of those other extra pieces on there. See if you want to add more to the inside of it. It's sometimes nice to have a little bit of those die cuts on the inside of the card as well as on the front. It just adds a little bit of continuity to it. Not necessary, but it's something fun. If you want to, you can absolutely do it. I chose not to, but by having this acrylic block on there and then just placing things, you can kind of see if it's something that you like or whether you don't want to. So with all of the pieces glued onto my cards, one of the things that I like to do with little animal die cuts is I like to use black glossy accents or black enamel accents for the eyes. It gives it a little bit of dimension, and it's really nice and dark black, and it's glossy. So these particular die cut fish, when you went and die cut them, it left a hole where that eye was, so you pretty much see the blue behind it. And rather than seeing that, I thought using the enamel accents would be a nice touch and give it a little bit of a different texture. So after I have the enamel accents on all of those pieces, I'm going to take some glossy accents and I'm going to put some bubbles on my background, again, to add a little bit of extra texture. And with underwater cards, I always think it adds more interest by having some glossy bubbles. One thing to note is it does take a little while for that to dry. So I typically will go do something around my house and not be in the room. One thing that you can do if you're in the area and you want to be able to regularly test and see if things are dry is take a scrap piece of cardstock, put a few dots on there that are about the same size as the ones that you're using on your card. And periodically you can check and see if it is completely dry. It will dry on the outside before it dries in the center. Personally, I find that it's just safer if I go and do other stuff around my house, and usually there's enough to do to keep me away from my craft room for a little while. But it is a way to easily test whether your glossy accents are dry without accidentally possibly damaging your card. So here is the final result. I think they look really, really adorable. I love those water backgrounds to them, and having those die cuts already made these cards come together super quickly. They have a lot of texture because of the different colors on those die cuts as well as the foiling, and they turned out great. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. Have a fantastic day.